Hello and welcome to Shaking and Sipping. This is the show where we shake up a cocktail or other mixed drink, have a sip, talk a bit about its history, maybe some variants, and see how it is. We're continuing our quest to work through the IBA's official list of cocktails to see how those stack up. We're in the second section. These are the contemporary classics. This week's contemporary classic is the Singapore Sling. Now this is kind of an interesting one because sort of like the Porto Flip, which was the only flip mentioned in the list and is not really a traditional flip, although it's, I guess, closer to one than this one is. This is the only drink in the list that bears the name Sling, and really, although there's definitely a historical connection there, no real resemblance of this drink to any kind of sling. So we've mentioned slings a number of times on the show before. I thought we'd start off, since we've never actually made one, by just finally making a sling, which is a very simple, kind of boring drink. So this is, of course, the sort of original cocktail, right? The cocktail initially is often referred to as a bittered sling, because it is a sling with bitters in it. So I've got a double old-fashioned glass here with a splash of water in it. Into that, I'm going to put in a scant bar spoon of sugar. We stir in that sugar before adding the ice so that it's more soluble. Then we're just going to grab some gin. Now, when this drink was originally common back sort of the beginning of the 19th century, end of the 18th century, this probably would have been a Hollands, Ginebra, or perhaps a Plymouth. We're just not going to do that just for fun. I'm going to pull out Ford's. We haven't had out Ford's in a while. That's a modern, slightly more botanical London Dry. Give that another stir to integrate. Then that is essentially it for a sling. When you do see something added, at least early on, it's generally lemon, whether that's a splash of juice or just a twist. You see it both ways, depending on sort of when and where you look. Just going to express. Good, I got some nice oil out of that, and toss that in. And this, finally, after 60 episodes or whatever it's been, is a sling of gin. So I get lots of that lovely orange oil right on the nose. Then it tastes, exactly how you would expect it to taste. It tastes of the gin, slightly sweetened, slightly watered down, with just that nice bit of brightness from the lemon. Hits sort of right at the beginning, but then lingers top of palate as you're going through the different botanicals. There's not really a lot of flavor notes to give here. It tastes exactly of whatever gin you're using. So it tastes of all of those botanicals. Now, the gin sling and slings in general, like I say, go back to at least the late 18th century, and they've stuck around, sort of. You see them in various places. They're certainly less common as time goes on, as people begin adding first bitters to make cocktails, and then all the different liqueurs and all the different things that have happened after that. There was also something, which I'm not sure if it's actually relevant to this drink, but just feels like it's worth a mention, called a pink gin, which I'm not going to make, but the idea is basically that you rinse a glass with some Angostura Bitters in it, and then you add to that gin, and occasionally sugar, occasionally water, occasionally club soda, depends, and then drink that, and so that coating of Ango gives it a little bit of a reddish pinkish hue. The only reason why I think that's relevant is where we're going historically here. I don't know if it's really tied, but there is this, that's a drink that emerged from sort of a British naval sort of place, which makes me think maybe it was in the back of someone's mind here. So we're going to come forward to Singapore in the late 19th century. So at this time, Singapore is a British colony, and with some of the surrounding islands and things, it's part of something called like the Straits Colony or the Straits region or something like that, because there's all the different water passages between these things, right? And at this time, there were a few hotels in Singapore, which were sort of largely sort of tourist destinations. and lots of colonial people hanging out there doing things. And at this time, apparently, gin slings seem to have been a very common occurrence at these bars in general. And we will dig into this a little further in a minute, but we see that referenced several times from the late 19th century. By the very early 20th century, I think as early as 1903, I believe it is, we start to see the gin sling really being referred to as sort of a specialty of the area, and you sometimes hear them referred to as pink slings, which again, I don't think these were pink gins. I think they're the predecessor of our Singapore sling, but it is interesting because there is that British colonial Navy connection there. I wonder if that's sort of around in the back of folks' minds. Anyway, this drink, this sort of pink sling, the gin sling in Singapore, etc., by sort of the 1915 to 1920 time period, is being referred to as a Singapore sling, at least in some places. And by 1930, when we get Craddock's Savoy Cocktail book, which we bring up all the time, there's a drink in there called the Singapore sling. There's also a drink in there called the Straits sling, which is why I mentioned earlier about that alternative name for that colony and area. And so we don't know for sure where these different drinks emerged from exactly and how they came about, but there's a pretty decent story tied to a gentleman whose name I'm going to mispronounce. It's a Hainanese name, and the romanizations I've seen of it vary, some of which I think are actually like Mandarin romanizations, so I'm not entirely sure, but it's something like Niam Tong Boon. Not sure. I'm going to call him NTB for the rest of this segment here, and I'll put his name on the screen at some point. And this gentleman has a crazy, crazy life. There's a great article by Theodora Sutcliffe, which I will link in the doobly-doo. That's sort of her, she sort of like crashed the family reunion for these folks in Singapore, and also managed to do an interview with some like vaguely connected Australian cousin of his and his current and his great-grandson and all these different people, and it's this really fascinating interview. It doesn't really solve anything about the drink, so I'm not going to use it heavily here, but NTB just had this crazy life. When he's like 14, he right before like bedtime or something, he knocked the really important like roast that was for the Chinese New Year celebrations like into the fire, and so before he could be discovered and punished, he ran away and somehow like snuck aboard a French sailing ship and got a job on that ship and passage to Vietnam, where he started working in a hotel and then became like their head bartender whilst learning English and French fluently. And then moved with like the head chef of there to Singapore, where he became the head bartender at this major Singapore hotel. But then the Raffles Hotel, which is where this drink supposedly hails from, upgraded their hotel and added the exciting amenity of electric lights in 1898, I believe. And so he moved over there and became the head bartender. Already an interesting enough story, not getting into the part where he like owned a rubber plantation and ran this lodging house and would give people free lodging if they would do jobs at different places, and then he'd help them get their money out and get back to China and all kinds. I mean, dude had a fascinating life. He was also allergic to alcohol, which is a fun part of this story as head bartender. Apparently not in such a way that it would like really harm him or anything. Like he could taste his drinks, but after like one drink, his face would be bright red and like slightly swollen. So just a fascinating character. Anyway, he is commonly associated with this drink, and Raffles Bar to this day, who really leans in on, the bar is called The Long Bar, it's at the Raffles. They really lean into owning this drink to this day. They say he created it in 1915, which almost certainly isn't true, because he died sort of either at like January 1915 or the end of 1914, so that's probably not true. But it does seem like this drink, from a fairly early time period, was associated with basically the two main places in Singapore, where this hotel he had worked at previously, I don't recollect the name, and the Long Bar at the Raffles. And he had been the head bartender at the other place. He was currently the head bartender at the Raffles, really associated with him. And so the drink seems to have grown from a different drink called a Singapore Sling. And so what we see in the Craddock version in 1930, and we are going to make both of those, is the drink called the Singapore Sling is very simple. And then the drink called the Straight Sling is much more similar to what we have as a Singapore Sling today. So I think that Singapore Sling, as Craddock has it, is what was being referenced in those very early 20th century mentions of pink slings and just popular gin slings in Singapore. Those were the sort of house style of the bars in Singapore, probably in TB's doing, or at least he was involved. And then over time that grew into this more complicated drink called the Singapore Sling later. It appears that in sort of the 1970s, a new person took over the bar and added some more ingredients to it and gave us basically the modern version. And so the IBA's version, very similar to the 1970s Raffles version as far as I can tell. A few small tweaks, but similar. And then the drink's just been all over the place in terms of variants and what's correct to make it and whatnot. So we're not going to do a ton of variants today. I'm just going to make the 1930 Singapore Sling and then the IBA spec Singapore Sling. But this is a drink that Embry mentions in the 40s that he's never seen the drink made the same way twice. And then if you look into the history a little more, you see that throughout like the late 70s to the 90s, Raffles was making it with some weird homemade mix that apparently was bad. And in America, apparently the most common way to make it was just to mix gin and sour mix. I don't know what that's about. But so this drink's been all over the place. And so I don't think the IBA's version is correct, but I think it does capture that 70s version, which is sort of a take on a 30s version, which evolved from this sort of 1900 pink sling. So let's mix up the Craddock 1930 Singapore Sling, which again is what I think is that 1900, 1903 pink sling. Alright, so Craddock calls for 1/4 of a lemon. These lemons are quite large, so I'm curious what 1/4 is going to net me. I'm guessing that this should be something like 1/4 ounce. And yeah, I'm not even partially through squeezing that lemon and I'm already at 1/4 ounce. So we'll put just a hair more than 1/4 ounce, but I can't imagine he was anticipating lemons this size. Then his measurements on this are not precise. It's kind of confusing the way he has written it. He definitely wants a dry gin here, and he wants half as much of the dry gin as the next ingredient that we're going to put in, which I don't think I have the right ingredient. So basically, none of this is going to make sense. I'm going to do this equal parts with the next ingredient that I'm going to put in, and I'll explain why in a bit. So we had about 10 milliliters or so of our lemon juice. We've got 30 milliliters or 1 fluid ounce of a London dry gin. And then I'm also going to go in with 30 milliliters or 1 fluid ounce of Heering cherry or cherry Heering. Cherry Heering is a cherry liqueur. It is a very sort of specific one. It's Danish. It's from some specific Danish cherries. It has a really funny note on it that this is made by appointment to Her Majesty the Queen Marguerite II, purveyor of cherry Heering. And that's common, of course. You see that in monarchical countries a lot of times, that certain products will say that they're the royal purveyor of whatever. I just find it weird in this instance that Peter F. Heering Company is the official purveyor of Heering. Like, of course he is. If it said purveyor of cherry liqueur, that would make sense to me. But of course, Heering is the purveyor of Heering. Why even say it? Anyway, the reason why I think those proportions are a little bit sus is he's talking about cherry brandy, by which I think he might mean Kirschwasser, which sometimes is called for in a Singapore Sling as well. But that, I'm fairly confident, was something like cherry Heering or a similar cherry liqueur product with some sweetness to it, as opposed to a much drier cherry brandy like a Kirschwasser. I don't have any Kirschwasser, so I use the Heering, but I cut that back to be equal parts. We'll see how that works. I'm gonna grab some ice. And we're just going to strain this over a big rock in a double old-fashioned glass again. I think this is probably supposed to go in like a large coupe with then just like a little chunk of ice in it, but I'm just going with this because it gives us some options for what he wants us to do, which is to top this with soda water. I certainly don't want to fill this with soda water, but we'll throw in a bit. I've got my beloved Q again today. Haven't had that the last few soda watery episodes, so that's nice. I'm just going to give that just a turn to integrate. Don't want to lose the carbonation. And this is something that's not accurate to, but is somewhat approaching a 1930 Craddock spec Singapore Sling, which I assert is the 1900-ish version that NTB and others at the Singapore hotels were making. Nose is incredibly cherry forward, but in a dark place. More of a dark cherry note, not a lot of sweetness per se, although I can tell it's going to be sweet. Is a little sweet. I'd love to see a less sweet cherry liqueur here. Doesn't taste bad at all. It's actually slightly syrupy. I think we could use a little more club soda there. Yeah, the seltzer really is nice in there. A little bit of carbonation, a little bit of dilution. This really tastes like some sort of a cherry phosphate or a cherry soda or something. This is incredibly, the gin is not reading as gin at all. Sort of mid palate to late palate. There are some botanical, there's some of that juniper, maybe a root note of some kind, but it's playing right into the cherry. So it's almost more like drinking like a cherry Coke or something, where you've got this cherry flavor, but it's mixed in with some bitter, cola nut or coca leaf or, some of those flavors. Very reminiscent of that. I think this is tasty. I don't think it's a great sort of drink as like a complex mixed drink. I think it's a great, this tastes like soda. So as mentioned, the modern version has just a crazy number of ingredients. We keep the gin, we keep the cherry Heering, which again I think is correct to this drink, if not that 30s version necessarily. The big thing that I'm fairly confident was added early on, when NTB was around presumably, is Bénédictine, which we've talked about a few times before. It's a very sort of odd herbal liqueur product. The other pieces, I'm not entirely sure. I think that lime definitely makes sense. Whether or not something like Grenadine was added early on, I don't think it was. I think I'm not even sure if that was in the 70s version. I think that's a very late addition. But let's get going. We're going to start off with some Angostura Bitters, which I think both make sense, and sort of, again, why I mentioned the pink gin connection. I think that is in someone's mind to some extent. You want just a dash or two of the Ango. I want 15 milliliters, or about half an ounce of lime juice. Recipe from the IBA has 10 milliliters of grenadine. Again, I don't think that was an early ingredient, and I think that by the time it did show up at some point in the 70s, I don't think it was anywhere near 10 milliliters. I think it was maybe a bar spoon, if that. I also, since I don't think it was original, I'm using the Terrible Roses product here. We've talked about before on the Let's Make a episode about Grenadine episode, whatever that was called. But I think it makes sense here, because I think it's here for color and nothing else. Then a frankly unnecessary amount of pineapple juice. They want 4 ounces, 120 milliliters. There's 60. There's 120. Now to bring in the other liqueurs. So of Bénédictine, we want about 7.5 milliliters. It's a quarter of an ounce. We want that same quarter ounce of Cointreau. Cointreau is generally specifically called here, though I'm sure you could get by with another triple sec if you don't have any Cointreau handy. 15 milliliters, or half an ounce, of cherry Heering. And finally, 30 milliliters, or 1 ounce, of a dry gin. Bombay is always my standard. Apparently, NTB was partial to Gordon's. Apparently, the guy who took over the Raffles bar in the 70s had some weird behind-the-scenes deal with Beefeater, so he changed everything to be Beefeater. Use whatever you like there. I know some folks actually like this with Old Tom as well, so feel free to do that. Then we'll just go ahead and strain that. You'll generally see this in either a Hurricane or a highball glass. Raffles Long Bar has their own like special sort of Hurricane glass that they use, which is fine, but we're just going to use a highball glass here. Then garnish is generally a wedge of pineapple as well as a maraschino cherry. If you watch the show, you know I don't think all that highly of pineapple and don't tend to keep fresh around, so we'll just go with the cherry. And this one often has a straw in it. Since we don't have that giant obnoxious pineapple garnish, I don't really see any reason to go in with a straw. We do have that nice head of foam that pineapple gives you. I mentioned before, but there are actually different types of pineapple juice. So this is just regular, whatever pineapple this is. If you use the right sort of pineapple from that region, whatever, it'll give almost an egg white-like head to it, but that's fine. That nose is just a mess. So I get sort of cherry and pineapple. I think the cherry I'm reading, though, is actually the maraschino on top. In the drink, it's just sort of muddled, a little bit of pineapple-iness. Yeah, that's too much pineapple juice. It's very pineapple forward. It's not bad, though. As someone who doesn't like pineapple, there's enough else going on there that it is interesting. Yeah, it's interesting, but the pineapple is always sort of threatening to take it back. It sort of starts with this little sweet note that sort of starts to open, and it's like the lime happening, maybe something in the Cointreau just starting to open, and then immediately I'm hit with pineapple acidity. And that, yeah, it's so weird. As that rolls to the middle, again, like threatening to poke out I get a stab of juniper, I get a stab of something from the Bénédictine, and then immediately I get the middle palate of pineapple. It's so weird. The finish is actually kind of lovely. The finish is this dark cherry, slightly drier place, really cool tail. There's just too much pineapple. We've already made enough versions on this, so I'm not going to make a whole new one from scratch. I might play with it and add that in the blog article, but I think if I were doing this again, cut the pineapple by about half, maybe put in one more shake of Angostura, and I think at that point we're kind of playing with something. There are versions of this that have this topped with soda water as well. That doesn't appear to have been traditional to any of the NTB versions, and it's not in the current IBA spec. I don't think it needs it. This doesn't have that syrupy quality that the last one did. There are also some versions of this that call for adding orange bitters. I kind of like that idea. We're going to give that a try. Three shakes of Scrappies. I maybe should have grabbed Regan's for this, actually, now that I'm pondering orange bitters, but I've already got the Scrappies. Let's see if we can even read those, or if they are totally lost in pineapple land. Nothing on the nose. Yeah, you know what? That's kind of cool. They're still lost in pineapple land, but I can read them. Yeah, so mid-palate, when that mid-palate sort of main pineapple place takes over, there is an orange blossom component happening behind it, which then sort of stays on into that cherry trail. That's not bad. Yeah, we'll see if I work up an alternate version of the editing room. Steven here. I think I did get a pretty decent version of the drink. Check the blog for my final recipe. But off the top of my head, I would say do what I did, except add the orange bitter, double the Ango, have the pineapple. I think that'd be it. I think that might kind of rule. Well, thanks so much for coming along this week on our Singapore Sling adventure. If you haven't tried one, I think there's an interesting drink in there somewhere. There's certainly a lot of interesting history to it. There's a lot to sort of dive into with NTB and all the different variants of the drink and changes in ownership and everything. It's something to look into if you're into those kind of things, and I think it's just a great jumping off point. It's too many ingredients, but I think it's a good place to think about what you could cut out. I think you could lose some of those ingredients like the grenadine entirely, maybe sub some other things. I think it'd be a fun drink to really spend, a couple weeks just making one every couple days and seeing if you could really lock something in. We'll have a write-up on shakingandsipping.com, the blog, where we always have a write-up on this and each other drink. Most weeks we'll do IBA in real life, where we'll go to a local Seattle cocktail bar the day after this video post to see how they make it, if they have variants, etc. Currently, we are planning on doing that this week, but never know until we've gotten that done. So you can follow on Twitter at shaking_sipping. We'll always post when we're doing one of those IBA in real life sort of things. That's all I've got for you this week. Please do all the YouTube stuff, like, share, subscribe, tell your friends, leave a comment, etc. But we'll be back next week with the next drink from the IBA's list. Until then, happy sipping. Cheers.